China wants to buy more oil from Alberta, and according to Alberta's own investment chief, with all the uncertainty in the world, especially the uncertainty created by our friends down south, China prefers to work with Alberta because we are stable, reliable, and high quality. That statement lands like a geopolitical flare. It signals a shift larger than a simple trade promotion. It shows a Canada that is no longer boxed into a one-customer future, and an Alberta that is rapidly stepping into a global energy market reshaped by disruption. Today, we break down why China is moving toward Alberta oil, why Canada suddenly has leverage it hasn't enjoyed in decades, and why this moment is quietly undermining the assumptions Washington has held about North American energy for half a century.
And with all of the uncertainty that currently resides in the world, especially the uncertainty being created by our friends down south, dealing with a reliable Alberta, which has predictable products, high quality, is something that they want to continue to build on and continue to work on. Most people in Alberta probably know that the Chinese invest largely in our economy, and in oil and gas, their investment is well over $60 billion, which represents almost 50% of all the money that China invests in Canada. So certainly an important trade and investment partner for us.
A Canadian trade mission involving federal officials and provincial leaders from Saskatchewan and Alberta just returned from China with results that very few analysts predicted. China agreed to ease tariffs on Canadian agriculture, especially canola. Canada, in return, offered structured openings for Chinese electric vehicles. More importantly, a series of private meetings set the stage for new Chinese investment tours in February, targeting energy, petrochemicals, agriculture, and even tourism infrastructure inside Alberta. But the most striking moment came from Rick Christjones, the CEO of Invest Alberta. He revealed that China has already become the largest buyer of oil shipped through the Trans Mountain Expansion pipeline, grabbing a commercial position that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. He added that China wants even more Alberta crude as it diversifies away from politically volatile suppliers and adapts to disruptions created by U.S. strategic decisions. This is happening at a time when Canada is pursuing a more independent foreign economic strategy under Prime Minister Mark Carney, while President Donald Trump continues applying unpredictable tariff pressure across North America. With Beijing searching for reliable long-term suppliers, Alberta suddenly finds itself in the middle of a geopolitical realignment it did not initiate, but stands ready to benefit from.
For decades, the U.S. held a privileged position over Canadian crude. Most Alberta oil flowed south through infrastructure designed to serve American refiners, giving Washington a natural form of leverage. When political tensions rose, the U.S. knew Canada had limited alternatives. That era is ending. With the Trans Mountain Expansion now moving barrels to the Pacific, Canada finally has a functioning route to Asian buyers. China becoming its top offshore buyer dramatically reduces the U.S.'s structural advantage. Suddenly, Canada has choices. And in international politics, the ability to choose is the foundation of sovereignty. Nothing irritates Washington more than losing leverage it once assumed was permanent. But Canada's new export flexibility is not an act of defiance. It's a correction to decades of one-sided dependency. Alberta is signaling that its resources are global commodities, not regional obligations, and that the U.S. cannot expect the deference that came from being the only viable customer. Beijing's interest in Alberta oil is not emotional, ideological, or symbolic. It's practical. China wants suppliers who are consistent, legally stable, and insulated from abrupt foreign policy swings. Canada meets all three criteria. This shift did not happen in isolation. China has reduced purchases of U.S. crude, partly because American energy exports fluctuate with political cycles. When a single White House announcement can trigger price jolts or revise export priorities, long-term planning becomes difficult. Canada, by contrast, offers predictability. The rule of law prevents sudden export bans, the political system avoids disruptive shocks, and Alberta's production capacity has proven resilient through multiple global crises. China is not choosing Canada as a geopolitical partner. It is choosing Canada as a hedge against volatility, against tariffs, and against the weaponization of supply chains. And that calculus, ironically, gives Canada room to maneuver even as the U.S. tries to tighten its strategic hold over North America. The quote from Alberta's investment head, blaming uncertainty created by our friends down south, is remarkable because of how casually it was delivered. Canadian officials usually avoid provoking Washington, but this time the criticism was direct and unfiltered. It reflects a broader truth.
Provinces and industries are tired of adjusting their entire export strategy every time Washington shifts its political mood. Alberta is no longer willing to build its economic future around the instability of U.S. domestic politics. Instead, it is diversifying, not because it wants to antagonize the United States, but because staying dependent on a single customer is now considered a strategic liability. And that shift, subtle, rational, and economically justified, carries enormous consequences for the balance of power in North America.
Prime Minister Mark Carney has made it clear that Canada intends to double its non-US exports over the next decade and rebuild an industrial base that can withstand geopolitical shocks. The Alberta-China dynamic fits seamlessly into that agenda. It is not a pivot away from the US, but rather an expansion toward a multipolar trade posture. Carney's message is simple. Canada will not allow its prosperity to hinge on decisions made in Washington. By opening new markets, strengthening Asia ties, and rebuilding domestic capacity, Canada is asserting an economic autonomy it hasn't exercised since the early post-war years. What makes this moment potent is that Alberta, often framed as the province most culturally aligned with the United States, is now leading the diversification effort. When Alberta begins embracing non-US markets, the entire narrative of Canadian dependency starts to unravel.
The U.S. has not issued a formal response, but American officials understand exactly what is happening. China's emergence as a major buyer of Canadian crude, Alberta's public criticism of U.S. unpredictability, and the growing presence of Asian investment capital all weaken Washington's traditional bargaining position as Canada enters the 2026 USMCA review. Trump's team has relied on energy leverage to pressure allies into trade concessions. But if Canada can sell its oil anywhere, that tool loses its edge. And without that tool, Washington loses a significant portion of its negotiating power. China's interest in Alberta oil is not just a trade story. It reveals a structural shift in global energy politics and a broader Canadian awakening. Alberta is expanding its customer base. China is diversifying its supply lines. And Canada, for the first time in decades, has the ability to shape its own energy future without waiting for American approval. The bigger question moving forward is this. As Canada gains leverage, independence, and global reach, how will Washington react? And what happens when a traditionally quiet northern partner begins playing the energy game on its own terms?
The federal government's push to build a new pipeline from Alberta to Canada's west coast has been met with contention. But new polling by Ipsos shows that a majority of Canadians are on board. 68% of those surveyed say they somewhat or strongly agree that there should be a new pipeline through northern BC.
Canada just crossed a line many people once thought it never would. In the middle of an escalating trade war with Donald Trump's America, 68% of Canadians now say they support building a new oil pipeline to the West Coast. Not quietly, not reluctantly, publicly. This is not about Canada suddenly falling back in love with oil and gas. It is about something far more calculated. Faced with tariffs, trade threats, and political pressure from Washington, Canadians are signaling a shift in priorities. Energy independence now matters more than political comfort. And that shift should make the White House uneasy.
So what's driving the support? It's the trade war.
Given the trade relationship that we have with the United States, people are willing to compromise on climate change right now.
The catalyst for this moment is a new national Ipsos poll that reveals how sharply Canadian public opinion is changing. A clear majority now supports a new pipeline through northern British Columbia to the West Coast. Even more striking, an overwhelming share of Canadians say the country should expand oil and gas exports beyond the United States. At the same time, concerns about emissions remain real, but many respondents say they are willing to accept trade-offs in the short term. What is driving this change is not ideology, it is anxiety. The trade war has reframed the pipeline debate. For years, these projects were trapped in arguments over climate policy, regional tensions, and regulatory gridlock. Today, the conversation is being pulled into a different orbit entirely. It is about economic vulnerability and strategic risk in a world where access to the U.S. market can no longer be taken for granted. This poll is not about one piece of infrastructure. It is about how Canadians are reassessing their place in a more confrontational North American economy.
Donald Trump's trade doctrine is built on pressure. Tariffs are meant to force compliance. Uncertainty is meant to scare partners into line. But Canada's reaction points in the opposite direction. Instead of retreating, Canadians are asking a question Washington did not expect. What happens if the United States stops being our default customer? That question alone represents a strategic shift. When 83% of Canadians say exports should move beyond the U.S., they are not rejecting America, they are rejecting dependency. In trying to tighten control, Trump's trade war may be accelerating Canada's search for alternatives. This is where pipelines take on a new meaning. For decades, energy infrastructure in Canada was framed almost entirely as a climate issue. Today, it is increasingly framed as a national security issue. When nearly all of Canada's oil and gas flows to a single market, that market holds power. When that market weaponizes trade, that power becomes dangerous. A West Coast pipeline would not instantly replace U.S. demand, but it would create options, and in trade wars, options matter more than volume. They weaken threats, reshape negotiations, and reduce vulnerability. Steel and concrete may look boring, but in this context, they represent leverage. There is a deeper political shift beneath this poll. It shows how Canadians are redefining economic sovereignty. For years, Canada traded access for stability, assuming the U.S. market would remain open and rules-based. That assumption no longer holds. Trump's trade posture has delivered a blunt lesson. Dependence is not partnership, it is leverage. And Canadians are adjusting faster than policymakers expected. That is why the pipeline debate now feels different. It is no longer left versus right or west versus east. It is being reframed as national insurance. You may never need to use it, but without it, your negotiating position weakens instantly. Even in British Columbia, where resistance has historically been strongest, support remains solid. The question has shifted from whether Canada likes oil and gas to whether Canada can afford to stay boxed into a single export route while trade pressure remains unpredictable. The poll also reveals an internal tension. Canadians have not abandoned climate concerns. Many worry that expanding oil and gas production could raise emissions beyond control. Critics argue there is no immediate business case and no company currently proposing a pipeline. Those objections remain valid. What has changed is the hierarchy of risk. In the face of trade instability, many Canadians now see economic exposure as the greater danger. That does not mean the country has chosen oil over climate. It means Canadians are temporarily prioritizing resilience over idealism. Politically, that matters. It creates space for conversations that were previously untouchable. It signals to investors, regulators, and foreign partners that Canada is more open to strategic infrastructure than it once was. From the U.S. perspective, this shift lands at an awkward moment. America has long benefited from Canada's lack of export alternatives. Reliable Canadian energy flowed south, reinforcing U.S. energy security while limiting Canada's leverage. Now, Canadian voters are signaling something new. They are preparing for a future in which access to the American market is uncertain and conditional. This is not hostility, it is adaptation. Trump's trade war was supposed to strengthen America's hand. Instead, it is encouraging allies to hedge against it. It is important not to overstate what this moment represents. There is no pipeline approval, there is no construction timeline, there is no immediate economic payoff. Canada has not won anything yet. But what has changed is more subtle and more consequential. Public psychology has shifted.
Once a country starts planning for alternatives, it never negotiates the same way again. That alone alters the balance of power.
This moment also sends a signal beyond Washington, to Europe, to Asia, and to global energy markets. Canada is quietly indicating that it is serious about optionality. Not reckless expansion, not an abandonment of climate goals, but a recognition that strategic infrastructure and environmental ambition cannot exist in separate silos when trade becomes a weapon. For Ottawa, this creates a narrow but real window. Public opinion is no longer the hard stop it once was. The question is whether political leadership moves fast enough to translate sentiment into credible long-term strategy before external pressure intensifies again. So, does this poll help Canada in its trade standoff with Trump? Yes, but not in the way headlines usually suggest. It strengthens Canada's negotiating posture. It expands political flexibility. It signals to Washington that pressure tactics have limits and unintended consequences. Trump wanted leverage. What he may have created instead is resolve. Resolve to diversify. Resolve to rethink energy strategy. Resolve to prepare for a world where the U.S. is no longer the only door that matters. And that leaves one uncomfortable question hanging over the entire debate. If trade wars are meant to make America stronger, why are they pushing America's closest allies to plan for life beyond it?